In August 2019, police in a quiet Illinois suburb dug into the backyard of a well-kept home on a tree-lined street. What they uncovered stunned even veteran investigators: the remains of 7 infants, buried in shallow graves just steps from the back door. Each discovery raised the same question: who could have done this, and why were the answers hiding inside that very house? Eldon Cooper had built his reputation in Springfield, Illinois, through a small but successful logistics company he ran for over a decade. By his late 40s, the business was his pride, providing well for his wife, Valencia, and their only child, Talia. But in 2012, a series of failed contracts and mounting debts forced Eldon to shut the business down. Overnight, the family's stability shifted. With Eldon out of work, Valencia's role as a registered nurse became the sole source of income. Her schedule was demanding, long shifts at the hospital supplemented by online prenatal classes she taught from home as a side business. As Valencia's workload increased, Eldon spent more time at home. What began as idle hours soon found structure when he started volunteering at his local church. Initially helping with small tasks, his consistent presence and willingness to take on responsibility led to a steady rise in influence. Within a few years, he had become a trusted figure in church operations, often attending meetings and events multiple times a week. His standing in that setting gave him a sense of purpose he no longer found in business. At the same time, Talia was transitioning into adulthood. 18 years old and accepted into a nearby college, she chose to remain at home rather than live on campus. The decision made sense financially. Tuition and books were costly, and commuting from home avoided the expense of housing. The Coopers' home was also only a short drive from the school, making it practical for her to attend classes and return in time for part-time work or family obligations. With Valencia often away, evenings in the Cooper household were increasingly just Eldon and Talia. Eldon's routine revolved around church activities and home duties, while Talia's life balanced coursework, social outings, and helping with chores. On the surface, the arrangement appeared functional, even harmonious. But as Valencia's presence at home diminished, the household dynamic shifted. Eldon and Talia were spending more time together than either spent with Valencia, and the balance of relationships within the family began to quietly change. Dolores Cooper, Eldon's mother, lived only a few streets away and visited often, sometimes staying overnight. She had always been close to her granddaughter, but with Valencia's absence, that closeness deepened. Dolores filled her conversations with reminders about the importance of family loyalty and keeping private matters within the family. These talks were framed as wisdom from an elder, but they quietly reinforced a reliance on her and Eldon as Talia's primary support system. Valencia began noticing subtle changes in her daughter. Talia's style of dressing shifted, and her usual openness about her social life faded. Phone calls that had once been casual and chatty became brief, and her time outside the home decreased. When Valencia asked about her friends or weekend plans, the answers were vague, often ending with mention of spending time with her father or grandmother. Meanwhile, Eldon's influence over Talia was becoming more pronounced. Though he had no steady income, he began covering small personal expenses for her, clothing, outings, even college supplies, without consulting Valencia. These gestures, paired with the constant presence of Dolores, created a quiet dependency. In practical terms, Talia's daily needs were being met more by her father than her mother. As Valencia's work consumed her attention, the balance of trust and closeness within the family continued to shift, drawing Talia further into the orbit of Eldon and Dolores. By the following year, Valencia's unease had grown into a persistent concern. It wasn't one single event but a pattern of small incidents. Valencia tried to dismiss her thoughts as the result of exhaustion from work, but the feeling wouldn't go away. She decided to act. Valencia approached a few elders at the church, describing what she had observed and expressing her fear that the relationship between Eldon and Talia was crossing boundaries no father and daughter should. The elders listened politely but offered little more than reassurance that Eldon was a respected member of the congregation and unlikely to be involved in anything inappropriate. Unwilling to leave it there, Valencia took her concerns to local authorities. She gave a statement, explaining her work schedule, the shifts in Talia's behavior, and the increasing control Eldon seemed to have over her. But when Talia was questioned, she firmly denied any wrongdoing by her father. She insisted their relationship was normal, portraying her mother's concerns as misplaced and exaggerated. Dolores reinforced that narrative. When contacted, she spoke warmly of her son and granddaughter, describing their relationship as close but entirely appropriate. Her account directly contradicted Valencia's and carried weight given her proximity to the family. Without physical evidence or a disclosure from Talia, the matter stalled. Both the church and the authorities treated Valencia's claims as unfounded, and in the process, her credibility suffered. To those outside her immediate circle, it appeared she was a stressed mother misreading the situation. Inside the Cooper home, the dismissal of her concerns only strengthened Eldon's position. The rejection of her concerns by both the church and local authorities left Valencia without allies. Every attempt to revisit the subject with Talia ended in argument, and Eldon's presence in those confrontations made any meaningful conversation impossible. Feeling shut out of her own home and unable to protect her daughter, Valencia made the decision to leave. She found a small apartment across town and moved out quietly, taking only what she needed for herself. Despite her fears, Valencia chose not to file for divorce immediately. She hoped that physical distance might soften the tension and that Talia would eventually decide to live with her. Before leaving, she tried once more to persuade her daughter to come along. Talia refused without hesitation, telling her mother she would stay with her father. The exchange confirmed to Valencia how deep Eldon's influence had become. Once Valencia was gone, the separation between appearance and reality inside the Cooper home widened. Publicly, Eldon and Talia remained father and daughter, attending church together and keeping their roles intact. Privately, they began living as a couple. Eldon managed the household as if he were head of a traditional partnership, and Talia settled into the role without challenge. One of the earliest signs of her commitment came when she ended her relationship with her longtime boyfriend. Friends noticed the abruptness of the breakup but were given no explanation. Cutting ties with him removed one of the few remaining connections Talia had to life outside her father's reach. With Valencia out of the house and her peers pushed away, Eldon's hold on her was complete. A year after Valencia left, Talia turned 19 and learned she was pregnant. Within the Cooper home, the news was met without public acknowledgement, but behind closed doors, it marked the next stage of her relationship with Eldon. The pregnancy was kept quiet from anyone outside the house, and with Dolores regularly visiting, the small family circle closed in tighter. When the baby was born, there was a brief shift in the household atmosphere. Eldon showed signs of pride, holding the infant and speaking of him as if he would be part of their lives. For a short time, the child's presence seemed to anchor the home in something resembling stability. That changed within months. Eldon began describing the baby as a burden, focusing on the disruption and cost of raising a child. Talia, still dependent on him, did not resist his growing hostility toward the situation. One evening, the child was gone. Eldon told no one outside the house, and Dolores was there to help him bury the small body in the backyard, choosing a spot shielded from view. In the days that followed, Eldon maintained his routine at church, greeting acquaintances as if nothing had happened. Talia attended services alongside him, silent about the child's absence. Within that setting, they remained an admired father-daughter pair, while the truth lay hidden just steps from their back door. In the years that followed the first burial, the pattern repeated. Talia became pregnant again and again, each time delivering in secrecy under Eldon's control. None of the infants survived more than a few days. Each was killed shortly after birth and buried in the backyard, their graves marked only by disturbed earth. By the seventh birth, the sequence had spanned 7 years. Dolores' involvement grew with each pregnancy. She assisted in keeping Talia secluded during the final months, limiting any chance of outside contact. After each death, she helped Eldon in disposing of the bodies, ensuring no trace remained that could prompt suspicion from outsiders. Her loyalty to her son was absolute, and her presence in the home reinforced the silence surrounding the crimes. Occasionally, neighbors noticed Talia's changes in appearance and asked about the absence of any children. Eldon had ready answers, claims that the babies had been born prematurely and died in hospitals, or that they were living with relatives in other states. The explanations were delivered calmly and with enough detail to quiet casual inquiry. 2 years after leaving Eldon, Valencia's life began to take a new direction. While attending a community health event through her hospital, she met Cedric Jackson, an officer with Illinois Child Protective Services. Their first conversations were brief, centered on their respective work, but over the following months they saw more of each other. The connection developed into a relationship, and eventually Valencia moved into Cedric's home on the west side of Springfield. It was only after settling in together that Cedric began to hear fragments of Valencia's history with Eldon. She spoke cautiously at first, mentioning the failed marriage, her attempts to take Talia with her, and the strange closeness between father and daughter. When she described approaching both the church and authorities with her concerns, Cedric listened but found the details hard to accept without evidence. Cases of inappropriate relationships between family members did cross his desk, but the idea that such a situation could persist for years without intervention seemed unlikely. Still, Valencia's consistency in recounting events caught his attention. Over time, trust between them deepened, and Cedric began to consider the possibility that there was more to the story. Without informing his superiors, he started reviewing what public information he could access about Eldon: property records, known associates, and past reports to CPS. While his initial searches turned up little, the absence of any official documentation on Talia's life beyond school records stood out. It was a gap that, in his line of work, warranted a closer look. Cedric's position at Child Protective Services gave him access to a range of state-held records, and his quiet review of the Cooper household began to produce troubling gaps. In Illinois, every live birth requires a corresponding certificate and, if applicable, a death record. Yet there was nothing for any child connected to Eldon or Talia. No hospital entries, no clinic visits, no vaccinations. Nothing that would indicate a living child had ever been under their care. The absence of medical records was equally stark. Talia's own file showed no consistent prenatal care beyond her teenage years, suggesting that any pregnancies had been concealed from formal systems. To Cedric, the missing documentation didn't just hint at secrecy, it indicated deliberate avoidance of institutions that could create a paper trail. Wanting a perspective from outside official records, Cedric discreetly reached out to a former neighbor of the Coopers. The man recalled an incident from several years earlier when he heard the sound of a baby crying through an open window at the Cooper home. Days later, the sound was gone, and when he casually asked Eldon about it, he was told the child was staying with relatives in another state. At the time, it seemed like an ordinary explanation, but in light of Valencia's account, it took on a different weight. With these fragments, Cedric began to outline a private timeline. The pattern of missing records, paired with the neighbor's recollection, pointed to events that would not be explained away without physical evidence. He knew that confronting Eldon directly would risk destroying any chance of proving the case. If he was going to act, he would need more, and the next opportunity would have to come from inside the Cooper home. 7 years after the first burial, Talia was pregnant again. By then she was in her mid-20s, living entirely under Eldon's authority and cut off from nearly all outside connections. The pregnancy was hidden from the public as the others had been, with Dolores ensuring that only those inside the home saw its progression. No medical visits were recorded, and no preparations for a child were visible outside the property. When the baby was born, there was no announcement. As with the 6 before, the newborn lived only briefly. Eldon ended the child's life and buried the body in the same backyard where the others lay. Dolores assisted as she had every time before, and by the following day, the house appeared unchanged to anyone passing by. The same week, Cedric received a phone call from a former neighbor of the Coopers, a different individual from the one he had spoken to months earlier. This caller, aware of Talia's history of pregnancies but having never seen a single child remain in the home, expressed concern that something was deeply wrong. The timing of the tip, so close to the disappearance of the 7th child, aligned too closely with the gaps Cedric had already documented. For Cedric, this was the break he needed. The repeated pregnancies without surviving children, the absence of medical or legal records, and the corroborating accounts from multiple people created a foundation strong enough to push the matter forward. What had begun as a quiet review was now a full-scale intervention in motion. Cedric prepared to bring the evidence to law enforcement, knowing there would be no turning back once the first official steps were taken. Cedric gathered every document, interview note, and timeline he had compiled and took it to a trusted contact within local law enforcement. The combination of missing vital records, the absence of medical documentation, and multiple witness accounts was enough to justify immediate action. Detectives opened a formal investigation and moved quickly to secure search warrants for the Cooper property. The operation began early in the morning. Eldon and Talia were both taken into custody for questioning while officers executed the warrant. Dolores, who had been staying at her own home at the time, was also brought in separately. Each was interviewed apart from the others to prevent coordination of their accounts. Eldon denied any wrongdoing, portraying the allegations as a fabrication by Valencia and her partner to destroy his reputation. Talia, quiet and reserved, answered questions minimally, providing no details that could confirm or deny the suspicions. Dolores, however, reacted differently. Initially firm in her defense of her son, her composure began to falter as the questioning grew more specific. Faced with pointed questions about the whereabouts of the children and the absence of official records, Dolores gave a partial admission. She acknowledged that there were losses, and that some burials had taken place in the backyard, though she avoided describing how the children had died. Her statements, though incomplete, were enough to validate the investigators' decision to proceed with a full forensic search of the property. Forensic teams arrived at the Cooper residence with ground-penetrating radar and evidence recovery units. The backyard, bordered by a weathered wooden fence, was divided into grid sections for methodical excavation. Within hours, the first small set of remains was uncovered, wrapped in deteriorated fabric and buried less than 2 feet below the surface. As the work continued, more graves were located. By the end of the second day, investigators had recovered the remains of 7 infants, each buried separately but within the same area behind the house. The condition of the remains indicated they had been placed there over an extended period, consistent with the 7-year span Cedric had outlined. Samples were sent for DNA testing, and results confirmed what the investigation had already pointed toward. Each child shared the same parents, Eldon and Talia Cooper. The findings aligned with Cedric's documented suspicions, including the years when Talia's pregnancies had been noted by neighbors but no living children had ever been seen. Even among experienced law enforcement personnel, the discovery was difficult to process. The scale and duration of the crimes, coupled with the family relationships involved, left a lasting impact on those who worked the scene. What had begun as a set of missing records and whispered concerns was now fully visible. A series of deliberate killings carried out within the walls and yard of a home that had appeared unremarkable from the street. The charges against Eldon Cooper were extensive: 7 counts of first-degree murder, concealment of a homicidal death, and conspiracy. Prosecutors presented the physical evidence from the backyard, the DNA results, and testimony from neighbors and investigators. Dolores's partial admissions, paired with Cedric's documented findings, reinforced the state's case. After a 3-week trial, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Eldon was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dolores Cooper faced her own trial on charges of aiding and abetting murder and concealment of a homicidal death. The prosecution detailed her role in concealing pregnancies, assisting in the burials, and supporting Eldon's control over Talia. Despite her age, the court imposed a lengthy sentence, citing the severity and duration of her involvement. Talia Cooper's case was handled differently. Psychological evaluations determined she had been under years of coercive control by her father, beginning in early adulthood and reinforced by isolation from outside relationships. While the court found her complicit in failing to protect her children, she was deemed unfit for standard incarceration and was committed to a secure psychiatric facility for long-term treatment. For Valencia, the verdicts brought a measure of justice but no restoration of what had been lost. She remained with Cedric, the man whose persistence had brought the truth to light, but the weight of the case lingered. The knowledge that her warnings had gone unheard for years, and the reality of what had happened in the home she once shared, remained a permanent shadow over her life.